another edition of News Feature, a presentation of the news department here at KPFK. I'm Corey Dubin, your daily host here on News Feature. Today we want to deal with the Federal Bureau of Investigation and their counterintelligence or COINTELPRO program, a program that was undertaken by the FBI in the 1960s and early 1970s that was designed to infiltrate, collect intelligence on, and ultimately destroy groups such as the Black Panther Party, the Students for a Democratic Society, and other progressive and radical groups that were operating in this country at this time. The reason COINTELPRO is in the news again this week is the evidentiary hearing of former Black Panther Deputy Defense Minister here in Los Angeles, Geronimo Pratt. Pratt is seeking a new hearing in his conviction in 1972 of the so-called tennis court murder. The defense, through documents obtained under the Freedom of Information Act and other ways of obtaining federal documents, is trying to prove that Pratt was singled out under the COINTELPRO program. Joining us by phone today is Donald Freed, author, playwright, and investigator. Don has spent years looking at the CIA and the intelligence community in this country. He wrote a book, Death in Washington, which was about the assassination of Orlando Letelier, who was the ambassador to the United States from Chile. And Don is extremely familiar with the COINTELPRO program itself and FBI activities in the late 1960s. Good afternoon, Don.
Good afternoon.
Don, let's start the program with your dogs in the background. Let's start, there are still people, I think, that are not familiar what the counterintelligence program or COINTELPRO was really all about. Maybe you could give us a little background, Don.
COINTELPRO, that ugly and resonating acronym that echoes down the corridors of the 60s and 70s, was a continuation, really, of earlier programs called Common Phil and others, all of them being cognate words having to do with intelligence, communism, what was earlier called by the FBI rabble-rousing bureau. Believe it or not, that was the term for earlier versions of the National Red Squad that the FBI became, rabble-rousing list. And these indexes, which the young John Edgar Hoover instigated for the young Bureau of Investigation called the BI then, over the years, the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, became, in its generic descendancy, finally, COINTELPRO. It was the offspring of decades of secret police, the longest in modern history, by the way, not Beria, certainly not Gables, or none of the various tyrants or monsters of the 20th century or the 19th century ever was head of the secret police in any modern nation-state as long as J. Edgar Hoover, some 50 years, about a quarter of the length of time of the existence of our republic. So you have in COINTELPRO the epitome, the apotheosis of the combination of a secret police mentality and the bureaucratization that modern technology could give to that ideology.
Don, let's look at how COINTELPRO was used in the late 1960s and early 70s against groups like the Black Panther Party and the Students for a Democratic Society.
It was, and indeed, a broad spectrum, including Southern Christian Leadership Conference and NAACP. And when you look at the spectrum of the COINTELPRO enemies list, you realize that it is not precise. It's not really simply anti-communist or counter-revolutionary. It is, in its essence, anti-democratic. And today you're focusing on the left wing of the COINTELPRO hit list. But if you were to look at the right wing of it, it would be surprising because it would involve simply mainstream Democratic-related organizations. But to focus on your question today in this very important case of Elmer Pratt, there was a kind of order of battle. The United States was broken up into war zones. The Black Panthers were perceived as in insurgency. The metaphor that Huey P. Newton had suggested from the middle 60s on, and which had been greeted with a good deal of contempt by certain intellectual circles on the left, that in fact the ghettos of America were the equivalent of colonies in the Third World, that the black liberation struggle was an insurgency, that the riots were not riots but rebellions and revolts, and that the secret police programs were not law enforcement but in fact counterinsurgency. And if you doubted Huey P. Newton and the Panther leadership, which included Elmer Pratt, if you thought the metaphor was perfervid and based on loose readings of Frantz Fanon and The Wretched of the Earth, and a sort of jackleg Maoism implanted to the soul food style to the ghetto, you've only to look at the sober, stunning, boring, and deadly dossiers of the FBI to realize that it is precisely a counterinsurgency model that the FBI set up. And that's what COINTELPRO was. It was, a domestic Phoenix program of a kind. And it involved, of course, every kind of official terrorism up to and including murder. And that murder, and in the case of the life incarceration of Elmer Pratt, you have as far as the secret police can go. Now, it remains selective, somewhat surgical, although it did not seem that way to black people. And it was successful in basically decapitating the black liberation movement, which had been its aim from the beginning. It had tied the Panthers down in courts across the country in millions and millions of dollars in bail. It sapped their energies. It planted informers. It conducted every filthy trick known to covert action. And finally, when it had no other alternative, the secret police assassinated the Fred Hamptons, the little Bobby Huttons, the George Jacksons, and it incarcerated Elmer Pratt.
Don, I'd like to look at some specifics about how they operated. You mentioned infiltration, murder. We could see these particular instances, of course, as complete violations of constitutional standards in this country. And I'm wondering about the operation of that in terms of the direction. Was it Mr. Hoover, and was the FBI putting out directives clearly that these activities were to be undertaken by the field offices?
Yes, that's a good question. To study the decision-making process and the linguistics of power, it is a fascinating discussion. People should do it. Anyone who can read and write should do it to really grasp the libido of the secret police and of the anti-democratic forces in the history of this nation, which the FBI represents. And when they would plant false information or send letters which attempted to pit groups against each other, the Karenga Us organization against the Black Panthers, or the Black Panthers against the Blackstone Rangers in Chicago, or SDS against Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And as they tried to pit radical groups against each other toward the end of Civil War and internecine slaughter, the directives from the SOG, which Hoover referred to as the seat of government. He referred to his office in Washington as the seat of government. So these SOG teletypes across the country to the various bureaus would indicate, of course, back and forth, that Hoover and his henchmen to the special agents in charge in the field would always spell out that this was not to be traced to the bureau. The sending of letters, the attempt at the incessant use of sex espionage, that is, attempting to use sex and rumors of sex as especially to destroy the movements which had many young people in them who were sexually active. And there was always the caveat and the warning that the Bureau not be involved. In my own case, for instance, the Bureau caused to be drawn a picture of a pig. And this pig, and this picture of the pig was on a leaflet, and there in very crude typesetting in what purported to be ghetto English was a rambling diatribe about Freed, who was a government agent of some kind and who would be taken care of. And it was signed "All Power to the People." It was then passed out by the thousands in the black ghettos of this country, and obviously its aim was twofold. That if something happened to me, a white supporter, a white sociologist working with the Panthers, if something should happen to me, the Panthers would of course be blamed, and thus two birds would be killed with the same stone. Well, eventually these leaflets and other kinds of COINTELPRO devices appeared when the church committee held its hearings in the mid-'70s in Washington. But the lawsuit that came from this against the government by the Panthers was never able to come to trial. The ACLU and other groups were not able to support the case to come to trial. If it had come to trial, we would have had the chance to see FBI special agents sitting on the stand talking about how they drew pictures and forged letters in what they thought was black ghetto English, and the shattering racism of this practice would have perhaps been sobering to the country. But the Black Panther cases have never, against the government, have never come to term, and it is perhaps only the Geronimo Pratt case which can reopen the can of worms that is COINTELPRO.
Don, are you familiar of a list that was submitted by then-Director Hoover called the Key Black Extremist List?
Yes, I am, and it's interesting to study the cable traffic on Martin Luther King, for instance, because there you have none of the ambiguity surrounding Panther leaders, but there the combination of use of violence and sex reaches a climax in April 1968. And a thoroughgoing study just leads inevitably to the conclusion that the FBI is involved in the murder of Dr. King.
That is something, of course, Don, that many groups, investigators have attempted to prove. And of course, to many North American citizens, I would say they believe that the FBI was involved. You mentioned some of the cable traffic around Dr. King. Some of what we know about was some of the letters about Dr. King's so-called sexual activity and other things about Dr. King that seemed to be originating in J. Edgar Hoover's desk.
In his brain. In his brain, which after all is only a pornographic caricature of the American mentality, but it is an important one. And Hoover's obsession with sex, with the touching of the races and of the sexes, provides a pathological dimension that we have understood as a function of fascism since any systematic study began, perhaps with Wilhelm Reich and others. And this psychosexual component to the police state mentality and the secret police mentality is long been overlooked by vulgar Marxists. I'm afraid that on the left we have combined vulgar Freudianism with vulgar Marxism, and it has not been a very rich mixture. And it is very important, I think, to look again at what lies behind the masculine protest, as it's sometimes called, or the extreme forms of male chauvinism that characterize the wording and the functioning of the secret police, and why their targets are inevitably associated with dirt, with filth, with sexual deviation, with perversion, and with subversion. And a sophisticated understanding of sexual phobias and political panic. I I really think leads one deeper into how to understand how to protect ourselves. For instance, a group now is preparing a conference in Los Angeles on domestic terrorism. We will have to ask what the common denominator is between the attacks on the abortion clinics, for instance, which so much resemble the COINTELPRO boilerplate of yore, and the attack, the verbal character assassination that followed the physical assassination of Professor Cooperman.
Don, I covered the Geronimo Pratt trial this week, and it was an interesting window, if I can use that expression. In one instance, I felt like I was sitting in a courtroom, Don, in the 1960s, watching trial lawyers cross-examine FBI agents about COINTELPRO and setting up, and watching the FBI essentially stonewall the defense and stonewall the case and make statements that were obviously not based in reality and contradictions that were incredible. Yet then every now and then I'd be shook out of that kind of time space and realize it was 84, and what the FBI was doing in that courtroom indicated that the same kind of things are probably going on today, and I'd like to look a little at that.
I think you raise a very important point, Corey. Not many people, even on the left, know that grand juries are sitting around the country, secret grand juries, and dealing not only with the Central American situation in the churches and the sanctuary movement, but dealing with ghetto organizations, black organizations, and somehow the black dimension, the most militant and revolutionary dimension of the American proletariat, has been abstracted out. And I give you as an example the tremendous victory in the ACLU case against the LAPD. I don't think it's widely appreciated in libertarian circles and First Amendment circles that the Michael Zinzin and the Kappa group, Coalition Against Police Abuse, these veterans of the Black Panther, Black Liberation movement, who eventually formed the very sophisticated and impressive Kappa group. It is violence against black people that provided the context, the environment, and the trigger for that huge LAPD suit that the ACLU has won. And in New Haven, where I've been part of a suit that just won $1,750,000, it's very similar to the LA suit. Again, the reason I was in New Haven was to cover the Black Panther trials, the ghosts of which you saw this week. So again, I think it was not understood in the 60s and 70s or today that the American movement for human rights and justice, the major term of the dialectic of that movement is black. And I don't think that has been understood. I don't think it's appreciated. And the alienation that exists politically perhaps is illuminated and ventilated a bit when we look again, as you did this week, and in your coverage, you see you have brought back to KPFK this afternoon a discussion that is, for most people, about a ghost. But these are unlaid revenants, unlaid ghosts, and the left must come to terms with people who not were just pushed or inconvenienced a little bit in the 60s and 70s, but who were murdered, paralyzed, sent to prison for life. And by your going into that courtroom and bringing the news out, I think you're doing an extremely courageous and necessary thing.
Don, let's look at the Reagan administration and the FBI today. The Reagan administration has, of course, unleashed the Central Intelligence Agency again throughout the world. The agency may well, at least the Reagan administration is willing to permit domestic work by the CIA, something that clearly violates their charter. The FBI is very active again, and we're about to see the appointment of Ed Meese as the chief law enforcement officer in our country. What does all this mean for you, Don?
Well, there you have it. When Ed Meese was in California with then Governor Reagan, he ran a secret police apparatus whose targets were black leadership, Chicano leadership, and especially the farm workers movement and student protest and student leadership. And from one end of this state to the other, California had a grid, an underground secret police movement that wired this state from tip to tip. It tied in to local sheriffs and police departments, and this was Meese who was in charge of the whole thing. And it also reached to Washington, to the Pentagon, in a operation called Garden Plot. That was the code name for it, which was a subsidiary of a larger operation called Cable Splicer. Well, Cable Splicer and Garden Plot was a California Pentagon operation, always remembering that Berkeley was seen as a laboratory for student protest, and that Oakland was seen as a laboratory for black rebellion, and that Cesar Chavez was seen as a potential leader of a migrant farm worker revolution. And if those farm workers could hook up with black workers and black lumpen proletariat and white students in an anti-war movement, then you might have the predicate for a new developing consciousness or sensibility. Well, Ronald Reagan, Edwin Meese, Mr. Clark, and others acted, and not just rhetorically, when Reagan said, let's hold their feet to the fire. If they want a bloodbath, let's get it over with, etc. No, what was set up with Evel Younger and others was a state secret police operation. That's who Edmund Meese was. He and Lowell Jensen, who is his associate at the Department of Justice, simply organized the panther hunting, panther tracking machine of Northern California. They put into play a counterinsurgency operation in the Bay Area. When you go back and look at what happened in the Bay Area, in this state, in the 60s and 70s, and what happened as the Panthers and the black revolutionaries were moved from the streets into the prisons as part of these sweeps and dragnets, so that the prisons then exploded. The explosion was taken off the streets. If you study the California prison system, the soul breaker as it's called, and the streets, and the campuses, and the attempt to murder Cesar Chavez in this state, you are reminded powerfully of what California was from 1966 to 1974, of what the Reagan regime in California really meant, of who Ed Meese, who is a former Army intelligence officer, really was, and of how we had better prepare ourselves to be very grown up in the next 4 years.
Don, with your wealth of experience in dealing with what we would call the police apparatus in this society, and I think a growing awareness that never died, it just lessened its visibility and is, of course, with us today. What do you suggest, Don, to people?
Through a broadcast such as KPFK, through speakers bureaus, through church groups, through bringing the anti-war and the civil rights movement under the same roof, that I really think it's wrong-headed to say, as we often say, we're only talking to each other. We're only talking to each other, and we're tired, and we're dispirited. I think that basically misunderstands what happens in groups. Groups talk to each other toward the end of greater motivation. That greater motivation reaches out. Change takes place both visibly and invisibly, but the index of it is the level of energy, motivation, clarity, and consciousness. And I really think numbers of people, not only pooling their creativity, but pooling their money, their presence, their physical visibility, whether it be in organizing around the Central American refugee network, whether it be around the women's clinics. In short, since we all have only so much time, energy, and money, we really have to demand of the groups with which we work that they reach out and make liaison and some sort of united front with other groups whose common denominator is human rights. And therefore, upper-class physicians working against nuclear war have to rub shoulders with, let's say, working women who are protecting an abortion clinic, or with minority people or students who are involved in attempting to stop police brutality. There has to be a kind of a recognition of natural allies and brought together. And when you have, or a organization like KPFK, for instance, where it can all come under one roof, then if KPFK and if other groups that have some organization will take leadership, then we have to all try to pool our energies, because if ever there was a time for a popular front, it is now against Ronald Reagan, Edwin Meese, William Casey, and as vicious a gang of thugs as has ever been in power at one time in a modern major industrial state.
We've been talking with Donald Freed, playwright, author, investigative journalist who has looked at the police apparatus in this country and been attacked by that apparatus on many occasions.